A mistake happens. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's barely noticeable. And sometimes nothing happens at all, it's just a memory. Something you said years ago, a social moment you still cringe at, a thought that suddenly replays itself while you're lying in bed. And almost immediately, a familiar conclusion appears. Something along the lines of, something's wrong with me. Not as a question, as a statement. You already know this mistake or this memory isn't the whole story. That's not the issue. The issue is that the thought doesn't feel like a thought. It feels like a verdict. A self-verdict. Final, total, and about you. For a lot of people, that verdict is harsh. You're broken. Just give up. You're a piece of shit. Now, I'm sorry to swear, but it matters to be honest about the actual thoughts people live with. For many, this isn't occasional. For some, those were very tame examples. It could be daily or hourly. And what's striking is how boring these thoughts can feel. Not dramatic or shocking, just familiar. And here's the important part. The mistake didn't create the verdict, and the memory didn't either. The verdict was already there. The mistake or the memory just activated it. This is micro-identity collapse. Not because your identity actually collapses, but because in that moment, everything about you gets reduced to a single conclusion. Context disappears, past effort doesn't count, and only the judgment remains. So what do you actually do when that happens? Not long-term healing, not fixing your entire personality, not rewriting your past. Really, the goal is just interrupting the moment where the mind sentences you. So this isn't therapy. It's not a replacement for psychological treatment. It's a small interruption, borrowed from real psychological approaches. But really it's just enough to create a gap between a trigger and a self-judgment. So here's 3 different approaches. See which one resonates with you. The first reframing is the simplest. When the thought lands, something's wrong with me, you quietly say, that's a verdict. Not angrily or dismissively, just factually. Because a verdict isn't a description. It's not an observation. It's a judgment about who you are. And once you see that, it stops feeling like insight, it starts looking like a habit. Second reframing does the same thing, but more explicitly. Instead of, I'm broken, you say, I'm having the thought that I'm broken. This matters more than it sounds like it should. Because you're not arguing with the thought. You're not trying to replace it. You're not fighting it. Really, you're moving it from a truth about you to simply an event happening in the mind. You're putting quotation marks around it. And the third reframing is especially useful if this happens repeatedly across different situations, multiple times a day, sometimes even when nothing has just gone wrong. You say, this is the something's wrong with me story. Not this is true, not this needs solving, just, oh, here it is again. Because once you recognise it as a story, a familiar one, it stops carrying the weight of a fresh discovery. It's no longer about this moment. It's about a pattern. So, you don't need to use all 3. You don't need to remember them perfectly. You don't need to believe them emotionally even. The goal isn't to make the thoughts disappear. The goal is to stop mistaking a reflexive self-judgment for a final statement about who you are. And when that verdict loosens, even slightly, something else becomes possible. Not fixing everything, just not reinforcing that judgment. Maybe that means one small next action. Maybe it means stopping for the day without self-punishment. That part will look different for different people. What matters is that the sentence didn't land. Over time, the verdicts still show up. They don't disappear, they don't get defeated, they just stop being final. And you start to notice something subtle. A mistake happens, or a memory surfaces, and the thought appears. But it lands differently. Not as a conclusion, more like weather passing through. And that matters, because once the verdict isn't final, your life doesn't have to restart every time it appears. You don't have to prove yourself again. You don't have to repair your entire identity. You don't have to get back to normal. You just continue. And that's the real relief. It's not confidence, not motivation, not a new self-concept. It's continuity. The ability to move through a day without being erased by it. And if all this video does is give you one moment where a familiar judgment shows up and you think, right, that's a verdict, or here's that story again, and it loses a bit of its grip, then that's enough, because that's how the sentence stops getting handed down. It's how you break the cycle. Not all at once, just often enough.